Today's hearing, we're going to look at recent work between international and domestic entities to close the tracking gap, as well as discuss future advancements in technology that will result in real-time tracking that can immediately alert authorities to any abnormalities during the flight of a commercial passenger aircraft. Let me say at the outset, it's absolutely unacceptable that today we are unable to locate or properly track a commercial passenger aircraft. Today, it's unacceptable that any passenger aircraft with 239 people cannot be located in an accident that occurred some time ago. So I believe that it's our responsibility to ensure that no commercial aircraft with passengers should be allowed to fly without a working and operable aircraft tracking device. And today's hearing will focus on where we are in that process. There are great implications to the problem of not being able to track aircraft even after an accident. But also now, when I visited ICAO and met with some of their officials in IATA, one of the concerns they expressed is the expansion of the international conflict zone. To date, a couple of years ago, fairly limited in some of the Middle Eastern states. Now it's greatly expanded over continents, over regions, and commercial passenger aircraft are flying in these areas. We should be able to know where they are. We aren't going to address today the shoot down of another passenger aircraft. But if we don't take steps to know where an aircraft is at all times and properly route them against danger, and not just know where they are when they're lost, there will be consequences. And I predict that there will be additional shoot downs of a passenger aircraft because we don't have these systems in place. A required and working global aeronautical distress and safety system standard is long overdue. Last year, after Malaysia Air 370, we had a hearing in the Transportation Committee. A number of issues were brought up that we had to address, and one that I cited back then and brought attention to the committee and the Congress was the need for action in getting, tracking capability of passenger aircraft. This, I might remind everyone, is 2015, and the technology exists, the capability exists. What we are lacking in is a standard for all of these operating passenger aircrafts across the globe. I was very pleased to meet last year with Michael Lawson, and he's the United States ambassador to ICAO. And upon our very first meeting, we discussed this issue, and he's with us here today. Most folks don't know what ICAO is. I was explaining it to staff, and when I became chairman of aviation in 2001, I didn't know what ICAO is, but ICAO is the primary and principal international aviation organization responsible for setting aviation standards, requirements, and protocols. That's for all aircraft flying across the globe. We have 191 nations who belong, and if you visit their headquarters in Montreal, I think it's bigger than the United Nations operation in New York City. Every country sends ambassadors to ICAO representatives. They have a general assembly or count, and then they have different layers of governance, and they set the standards for all aircraft. We have with us today Congressman Duncan, and he is, with Mr. Price, have introduced U.S. legislation, and I have a copy of their legislation, H.R. 772, which actually, having read it just in the last day or so, it complies with the standards or refers to the standards as set by ICAO to require certain standards that the U.S. aircraft adopt, and we'll turn to him for a better explanation shortly. But even if we can't pass this U.S. law without having the ICAO standards, American passengers could be protected, say, domestically with a domestic commercial flight if we passed it for the United States. But once they get outside our borders, ICAO is the primary responsibility, has the primary responsibility for standards setting. I've worked with IATA and met with their representatives, the very responsive International Air Transport Association, and that is an airline organization. They can set standards for their airlines, but they don't set the global standards, and they can require compliance of their membership. So that's why it's important for ICAO to act. Interestingly enough, you may not know this, but the United States provides about 25% of the funding for ICAO, so we have an important stake there. We have a great representative who's been working with folks. And not too long ago, when I traveled to Montreal, arranged a meeting with the president of ICAO to express our concerns on behalf of Congress of adopting that standard, moving that process forward. If we sometimes think the Congress or the Senate is slow, sometimes the international organizations, getting 191 countries to agree, that can also be time-consuming and difficult process. But I can't say that we could have had better representation than our ambassador has given us to that organization, or better cooperation. And I want to today hear an update. There was a recent meeting, and I believe today we're going to have an announcement on some of the standards being proposed that just were released, and we may hear more about the status of that. I think it's in draft. And then the important thing is the time frame for implementation. The fact is the technology does exist. The fact is that the technology is on most aircraft. What is lacking is a standard. There is an opportunity, I think Mr. Duncan's bill provides for it, for enhancing some of the capability of the technology. I've met with Mr. Hart, NTSB, and we'll hear from them shortly. They are working with the industry to try to come up with a tracking device that is not only more reliable, but also has a longer life and a better ability to track. And we'll hear the status of that. The long-term solution is, again, switching from a radar base to next generation air traffic control with global and GPS tracking. So we know where every aircraft is that has passengers at every point on the earth at all times, both for in the case of an accident, and then also keeping the passengers safe in some of the zones I talked about that pose great risks. So we'll learn today the status of the adoption of these international standards. We'll look at the requirements for potentially longer life tracking devices and better technologies. We'll hear from NTSB and others, the industry also, who have comments on standards should be set that are reasonable and workable and implementable as soon as possible. So Flight 370, although a tragedy with the loss of life of 239 individuals from that horrible experience, and still today not being able to locate that aircraft or those victims, we have a responsibility act to move this process forward. Today, there are approximately 90,000 flights around the world. The FAA estimates there are around 123,000 U.S. citizens boarding those planes every day. So while we can control domestic traffic and U.S. aircraft, it's important that international standard be there. We're looking at not just protecting citizens around the world, but our responsibility to U.S. citizens. And right now, the international standard is to check every 30 minutes when outside of radar. Of course, the long term is the next generation air traffic control. But listen to this, at 35,000 feet, a Boeing 747 has a cruising speed of 570 miles per hour. In 30 minutes, a plane can carry nearly 400 passengers, can travel nearly 300 miles before anyone knows where it is. That's not an acceptable standard today. So today we're going to look at finally the work between international, domestic entities, the industry, some of our safety organizations, and we'll hear where we are, and where we need to go, and how we need to get there.